All right, for our third topic this week. This past week, we saw the passing of Willie Mays. And, Willie Mays is a legendary professional baseball player. And he was really a giant in the first era of Major League Baseball, with Major League Baseball being America's pastime, so to speak, that included all the best players. So in a post-integration world, when you put all the best baseball players prior to integration, you had the Negro leagues, and then you had because Major League Baseball did not allow black players in, or did not allow Hispanic players in, and so forth. And so they separate leagues were created, and some of the best players were there, and some of the best players were in the major leagues. But you put it all together, and you have this essentially what's considered a golden age of baseball. And Willie Mays was really a giant in that. And so, what are your thoughts, just on Willie Mays passing and, honoring that man, and then also just the era that his passing kind of makes us remember and kind of marks how, we've moved beyond that into something, that's different, and, maybe lost touch with some of that to some degree.
First of all, obviously paid the respects to Willie Mays as great player, and seemed like a really good person, from what I read about him, and lived a long life. He died at 94. My joke would be, as preparing for this show, I can't get the name Willie Mays Hayes out of my head. You remember that movie?
No, not off the top of my head.
The one with Charlie Sheen, the baseball movie from the late 80s.
Oh, yeah.
He was like the outfielder, I remember. So I kept running reading. I kept thinking about that guy. But no, it's fascinating history, man. This whole, just as I even dove into reading about the Negro Leagues, and just kind of, really, really feeling like baseball is America's game. Baseball as a sport culturally also followed the culture of the country. When you look at kind of the post-Civil War era, as the country was kind of figuring it out again and getting back together, baseball became America's pastime and was beginning to be organized into formal leagues. And, there's early history that there were, I think, two teams early on that were integrated, did have black players. And in 1887, there was a team that refused to play the team that had the black players. And that team manager kind of capitulated and let the team go on, didn't let his black players play. And that therein started in 1887, full segregation and the exclusion of blacks in Major League Baseball, what will become Major League Baseball. And so that's developed black people like playing baseball too. And so that developed the need for some sort of league for blacks, which eventually became the Negro Leagues in the early 20s. So it just, it kind of reminded me of that end of Reconstruction, the beginning of Jim Crow, and the formal state of segregation in the late 1800s. Baseball mirrored that. And then, Jackie Robinson begins to integrate it in 1947, the same year that the military was integrated. And within, a generation, within 7 years later, you got Brown versus Board of Education. So it seems like kind of baseball went through a similar trajectory as the nation, which again made me feel like, yeah, this is America's sport. Wherever the culture has been, of America, the kind of sport followed. So I found, the whole thing interesting, but I'll pass it back.
No. And yes, I think, to start, to me, the biggest, thing that was just the paying the respects, because someone, just me growing up, and growing up as a sports fan, Willie Mays was like, a player that you looked at is like, I grew up thinking he was the best player, and I still, think this best baseball player ever, in terms of just looking at the league he competed in and the dominance he showed over the period he showed. And it was, to be reminded and to be able to get back into all that stuff when somebody passes, a lot of times we're able to do that. It was invigorating, to kind of see, and then the life that he lived. And I think that you make a good point as far as how baseball, it didn't mirror, it was more of a leading indicator of the, of American culture during that time frame, where you had this strict set, where you had initially, when they were sorting it all out, it was kind of like a Reconstruction period, like, oh yeah, well, we haven't gotten to segregation yet. But and so there were some integrated teams, and then they were like, hey, you know what, we need to make this rigid, and so you put this color line up, and you track that through until the 1940s, and also, though, the time period after Jackie Robinson broke the color line, and you had the influx of black players and all other non-white players into the major leagues, that the major leagues became bigger than they had ever been, in terms of like the quality of play went up, and, just the level of competition, so it was interesting to me in terms of that's kind of what we are trying to do in our society. One of the biggest problems when you have like the segregated society is that you limit the society's ability for progress. You restrict competition. You restrict the ability to build on. You're spending a chunk of your resources trying to hold a group of people back. And it's like, well, hold on. If we just don't spend resources trying to hold a group of people back, society as a whole will rise faster. And then if we actually spend resources to try to push everybody up, then obviously it will rise even faster than that. So you really see the self-defeat.
Don't forget, some people just feel good when they know they're pushing someone else to the side. But that's a whole different story.
And I mean, not everybody wants to be in an open marketplace. A lot of people would like just built-in advantages and not have to compete, so to speak. So, and that's whether it be an athletic context or whatever. So the idea that baseball showed that, okay, yeah, if we create a level playing field, or a relatively level playing field, it'll never be 100% level playing field, and let the cream rise to the crop, that we can go even higher than we could if we spend some of our time trying to keep others out. And, it creates also this interesting dilemma that also has come up over the past, month or so with, okay, the Major League Baseball decided recently to include Negro League stats into its historical database. And that, to me, I mean, not without getting into the actual numbers and everything like that, that was just interesting to me. And I know I wanted to kick this to you just in terms of how that also brings up another conversation that we have in our society, is this history of segregation and Jim Crow and lynching and all of this stuff, and how, what do we do with that history now? Like we're not that country anymore. Like we're still there, but we don't live like that necessarily anymore. And so what do we do in terms of remembering that stuff, in terms of acknowledging that it exists, in terms of learning about that stuff? Do we just bring it all in, just lump it all together and like try to smooth out anything? Or do we keep in mind that, and how do we learn about that? How do we teach that stuff? And I think that the stats conversation is a good analogy for that as well. So what were your thoughts on that?
Well, clearly it's not going to be taught in the public schools of Florida. So that's a whole different story. Or Arkansas. And
I guess they probably got to take baseball stats. You can't teach
maybe the private schools
stats.
Can teach them. Yeah, but the public schools are banned from it. But no, I think that's that's the whole culture wars right now, right? Some people just want to erase all this. Other people feel that it's important. It's part of the country's history, and I just think that tension's going to be there, unfortunately. But I do think that before I jump to the stats, I just want to jump to the comments of another kind of Hall of Famer type player, which was Reggie Jackson, who was speaking at one of these kind of commemorative days where they were commemorating Willie Mays and kind of the sport itself in Birmingham, Alabama. And that happened to be where Reggie Jackson began his career. And the discussion he had about the early 1960s and the segregation and the fact that there were a lot of restaurants and hotels that wouldn't serve the team because they had him, a black player, on the team. He also discussed how positive his teammates and his manager were, in terms of they wouldn't stay at hotels that wouldn't let Reggie Jackson stay there. And he tells a story about how he was kind of couch surfing with a few friends for about a month. And unfortunately, they told him he's got to leave because the whole apartment complex was threatened to be firebombed because they were letting a black man sleep on their couch. And so I think that's the part of the American history that isn't discussed, because for every Reggie Jackson who's still alive in his late 70s that experienced that, there's that person who was on the other end of the phone line who was making that threat to burn down that apartment building. And what happens is we as a culture still kind of haven't, I don't know if it's not accepted or haven't realized that a lot of those people are still around and they feel this very similar ways as they did 60 years ago. And so that to me was a very interesting part of this, and maybe a way to discuss or answer your question about how do we deal with this history is I don't know how we deal with it. I think it's going to be painful and messy, and probably for another 50 to 100 years till we're really past like any living memory of this.
Well, the living memory piece, though, is what's interesting about it, because the decisions we make in terms of how we're going to how this stuff is going to be remembered and documented and so forth is when that matters really is once the living memory passes. Because right now there's still people with living memory that can speak on this stuff, like you said, like the with Reggie Jackson telling his story. But after Reggie Jackson can't tell his story, or 30 years after that, then how's it going to remember then? I mean, we remember history now, all types of history we remember in a much more two-dimensional way than it actually was. And that's because whoever kind of established how this thing, whoever wrote the history, who established how this is going to be remembered, that lives on. And that doesn't always track to exactly what it is, even if there's competing narratives. So like the question of, and I'm not trying to get to an answer of whether they should do this with the stats or not. I mean, I don't think that that's really the content that I'm trying to get into right here. I more so am intrigued by the idea. Okay, so the effort they're trying to honor the Negro Leagues by incorporating the stats, but by incorporating the stats, do you actually, is it like an unforeseen circumstance where you end up 100 years from now, people don't understand the distinction between that. And it was like, oh no, it was just all, like the black players just wanted to play in the Negro Leagues because, like that was cool for black people. And then, or something like that. Like, does the significance get lost, or does that bring it to a place of, okay, yeah, this was one of the top places. And so I think
these are kind of like black people wanted to be slaves because they got skills and stuff.
I mean, we've heard people say that. We've heard people who profess to be serious people say that.
100 years from now, someone could say the Negro Leagues were just because black dudes wanted to be
exactly.
separate.
And so I
it's
think
their fault.
And so that's the what we're wrestling with. Like, we may not think this stuff matters, but what we're wrestling with is not necessarily how we're looking at this now, but how the claims and the arguments and the support people will be able to make for things later. And I don't think there's necessarily a right answer, but I think it's helpful if we're at least thinking about that.
Well, yeah, and I think, part of the reading, I learned that in 1969, the Major League Baseball Commission, I guess, the official kind of heads of it, had to make similar decisions because there were a bunch of leagues from the late 1800s to like the early let's say 1920. There were like 6 or 7 different all-white leagues. And some kind of like the NBA used to have the ABA, but it was like more of those. So in 1969, the league made a decision to incorporate all of those different leagues, the white league stats, officially into Major League Baseball. And the question was asked at the time, well, what do we do about the Negro Leagues? And because of how they felt in 1969, they said, no, we leave that out. So I think part of it is, maybe the long arc of American history and culture, which is recognizing that these people were excluded from participating and also having their stats included specifically because they were black, period. That is, just part of American history. So the Major League Baseball decided in 2020, let's start looking into this and let's see if it makes sense to correct what might have been a wrong. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but it might have, they obviously thought in 2020 different than they did in 1969. And here we are. So I think you're right. Does it run the risk of in future generations kind of whitewashing the history and just at some point the Negro Leagues will be forgotten? And maybe it does. But I don't think
the Negro Leagues will be forgetting the significance of the Negro League and what it was about. Like what things about it could be forgotten. Yeah.
No, but I think that's. I mean, it could be just like many things, like you said, have been forgotten in history. But I do support the merging of all these stats because I do think it's nice to see now that was it John Gibson or Joe Gibson?
Josh Gibson. Yeah,
Josh Gibson. Sorry. Is the highest batting average now. It's like, okay, so if you want to put the greats and compare them, then let's do that. I mean, could you imagine? And that's what I was thinking was Earl Lloyd was the first black basketball player to integrate the NBA in 1955, and I think he's still alive. But could you imagine if basketball was like segregated for a long time and you had players like Michael Jordan, and all these, and they weren't counted as even having played really and at a high level. So I just think that, it makes sense to.
Well, the stat issue is tough because it actually, and I've seen compelling arguments that baseball should go the other way and categorize stats from segregated leagues differently than even the major leagues. Like that the stats really should begin for major league stats should begin once the league
from 1947.
Yeah, and or whenever the leagues were substantially integrated, and the stats before that, which would be sacrilegious to many because that would be like Babe Ruth and all these other people. But the stats before that are just put in a different category altogether because the level of competition for segregated leagues is not going to be the same or as high as the level of competition in integrated leagues. And so when you're comparing baseball in 1960 to baseball in 1930, it's not the leagues. Those stats are not equivalent, but I mean, again, that's one argument.
I'd be supportive of that concept. It's like an alternative to merging them.
But I think the point, the biggest takeaway, I mean, this is just, again, I'll bang this again before, we close this up, is just that with the baseball issue, it illustrates that with any of these, there's no easy answer. We have to try to pick something that meets with our sensibilities that we think, acknowledging that the decisions we make are going to affect how future generations understand things and so forth. And then we have to pick something with that and then go with it and try to do the best that we can. But we can't sit around and wait for some perfect answer, So even though I question whether this is the right move, I commend Major League Baseball for doing it, for bringing in the stats, because it's like, well, what else are you going to do with it? At this point, you've gone this direction. That the direction they've gone, they chose to go in 1969 was to incorporate more. So it's like, all right, well, if you're doing the incorporating more game, then knock yourself out. But I recognize I'm not sitting here just throwing tomatoes from the cheap seats. Like that may not be perfect, but there is no perfect solution. And so we'll pick something and then we'll try to make it work. And that's the try to make it work piece is the piece that Americans going to have to hold on to more than anything, because the trying to do a pluralistic society takes work, ongoing work. It doesn't become easy. Like once you go beyond a single tribe or whatever, then it's just going to take work. But you can draw strength from that if you do it right, as baseball showed us.
No, it's interesting. I'll leave here with a fun fact that I learned. It's interesting. There was a guy who played in the Negro Leagues who played officially played on a professional baseball game in the MLB when we were alive, which I found fascinating. So the guy named Minnie Mignoso, he first played in the Negro Leagues in 1949. And at age 56, he was I think a hitting coach and a third base coach. And I can't remember the team. He was just not here, but they actually needed him to fill in. And he played a few games in the 1980 MLB season. And so I just found that fascinating. Like, wow, I was born in 78. So I was 2 years old. And a guy actually played during my lifetime in Major League Baseball who was a rookie in the Negro Leagues. So it just shows you how, when you talk about the living memory, that we're still very connected to this period of American history. And I think that's also why there's tension about it. Because
old guys like you are.
What was that?
I said old guys like you.
You were born in 79, don't be? Yeah. You were still 1 year old.
I was around. But that's good stuff. That's good stuff. But we appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review us, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys.
I'm Tunde Ogunlana.
All right, we'll talk to you next time.